In this Blender tutorial, I will show you how to create this procedural dark leather material. And this dark leather material is one of 3 procedural leather materials that I recently created, and I have 3 separate tutorials on my YouTube channel on how to create these materials. So if you'd like to check out the other tutorials and learn how to create these other procedural leather materials, I'll have the links in the description. But in this video, I'm going to show you how to create this dark leather material. So here is the node setup, and after we create the procedural nodes, I'll show you how to join the material together into this custom node group. So we have the overall scale to change the size of the material, then we also just have the noise scale, and then we also just have the leather scale. And then we also have some different colors here, so we have color 1 and then color 2. Then we have leather detail 1, so I can turn this down if I want less detail, or I can turn this up if I want lots of detail. And then we also have leather detail 2, and this also kind of changes the variation of the leather. And then we also have the roughness of the leather, and then finally we have 3 bump strengths. So we have the damage bump strength, so I can turn this up if I want to look really old and damaged. We also have just a noise bump strength, and then we also have the leather bump strength. If you'd like to help support me and this channel and purchase these materials, then you can get them on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page with the links in the description. And if you'd like to purchase all of my procedural materials, then definitely check out my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack with the links in the description. And you can also purchase my procedural material packs if you'd like to purchase packs of 10 materials. And if you'd like to learn how to create any of my procedural materials, you can check out my Blender Procedural Material Tutorial playlist here on YouTube. So real quick, I'm going to show you my scene setup if you want to set up the Blender file the same way that I have. But if you want to skip this part, then you can check out the timestamps in the video description and just jump to the procedural material. So what I did is pressed Shift A, I went here to Mesh, and I added an icosphere. Then I pressed Shift A, I went here to Mesh, and I added a plane, and this plane is going to be the cloth object. So I'm going to move the plane up on the Z-axis. Then I'm going to hit S to scale, and I'm going to type in 3 and then enter so that the plane is bigger. Then I'm going to go into edit mode with the tab key, and I'm going to use the object context menu, and I'm going to subdivide the mesh. Then right behind me, right after you subdivide the mesh, there's that little subdivide setting there, and you can turn up the number of cuts. So I'm going to turn this up to 60, and this way when we add cloth physics to the mesh, it'll have more geometry to work with. And I can go back to object mode. So then to add the physics, you can click right over here on the physics properties. And on the plane here, we want to add the cloth physics. Now I'm going to scroll right down here. I'm going to leave all the settings at the default, except that I'm going to open up the collisions, and I'm going to turn on the self collision. And then also I'm going to click on the sphere here, and over here on the physics properties, I'm going to turn on the collision. And this way, because it has the collision, the cloth is going to interact with the sphere. So you can now press the spacebar to play the timeline, and you can let the cloth simulate. And right about there is pretty good. So I now want to apply the physics, so I'm going to click on the cloth object, and we can click right over here on the modifier properties, and you can see it's been added as a modifier. So you can click on the arrow here and then click on apply. And then I also want to use the object context menu to shade the object smooth. And then also here, if you select this sphere, I'm going to click on this and just apply it as well so it doesn't have the collision. Now when modeling to the real life scale in Blender, the default primitive objects are a little bit higher than an average human. So I'm going to select both of the objects, and then I'm going to scale them. And after I hit S to scale, I'm going to type in 0.15. So just 0.15, and that way it is much smaller. And I'm going to bring this down into the center. And then I want to press Control A, and I want to apply the scale of both of these objects. So this is now the object's new default size. Now to make the cloth look a little bit better, I'm going to select the cloth, and over here on the modifiers, I'm going to click on Add Modifier, and I'm going to add the Subdivision Surface modifier. And then here on the levels viewport and render, I'm going to turn this up to 2, and that way the cloth looks quite a bit nicer. I'm also going to click on Add Modifier, and here under Generate, I'm going to add the Solidify modifier, and that way the cloth has a little bit of thickness, but then I'll just turn the thickness value down so that it is a very small thickness value. And then I also just added a camera, and I pointed the camera at the object. And if you select the camera, you can go over here to the object data properties, and I turned the focal length up to 100, and that way it just kind of zooms the camera in, and it makes things look a bit more flat, and I do like that a bit better. Now for the lighting, I added these 2 area lights right here. So this first area light is over on this side, and right over here, if you go to the object data properties, I turn the power to 150. And then this light over here, I turn the shape to rectangle, and I turn the power to 50. And I put this a little bit behind the leather object, and this way it's going to give a little bit of a rim light behind the object. Now to get some nice realistic lighting and reflections, right over here on the world properties, I added in the reading room HDRI. So this is a free HDRI from polyhaven.com. Links in the description if you'd like to download it. And I downloaded the 1K HDR version. So once you've downloaded the HDRI, you can click on the yellow dot here next to color on the world properties, and you can choose environment texture, and then just click on the open button, and you can open up the downloaded HDRI. Now if you want to make the background transparent so that you can't see the world in the background, you can go right up here to the render properties, and you can open up the film tab right here, and you can check mark the transparent button, and that way you can't see the HDRI in the background. And then also if you open up the color management right here, I set the view transform to filmic, and I set the look to very high contrast, and this will make the final image look more contrasty and saturated. So I'm in the shading workspace, and I've put the 3D viewport right over here, and I'm in the rendered mode so I can preview the material. And then right over here I have the shader editor to create the procedural setup. And then before we start, I'm also going to be using the Node Wrangler add-on to preview the different nodes. So if you don't have the Node Wrangler enabled, you can click on edit, and you can go to the preferences, and then over there in the add-ons tab just search for Node Wrangler, and you can check mark the Node Wrangler add-on, and I'll show you how to use it in the video. So let's click here on the new button to add a new material, and then I can just rename this material to dark leather. So let's now create the base texture of the material. So I will press Shift A, and I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for a noise texture. Let's stick the noise texture here, and then make sure you're in rendered mode by holding down the Z button and moving your mouse up into the rendered view so you can see the material. And I'm going to hold down the Control and Shift key and select the noise texture so that we can preview it on the object. And then also with the noise texture selected, I'm going to press Ctrl T, and that's going to add the texture coordinate and mapping. And let's use the object coordinates, because the object coordinates is going to place the texture on the object more evenly. So let's put the object into the vector of the mapping, and the mapping can go into the noise texture. So let's now change some of the noise texture settings. So I'm going to turn the scale up to 18, and then I do want it to be very detailed, so let's turn the detail to the max of 15. And let's also turn the roughness to a 0.55, so there's a bit more roughness. Now I want to make this noise texture look more interesting, and so I'm actually going to put another noise texture here in between the mapping and the noise texture. And because it's going to be going through the vector, it's going to distort the placement of the noise. So let's select the noise texture, and I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and let's stick it here before the first one. So now you can see this noise texture is being distorted by another noise texture. And then let's change the settings of this second noise texture. So I'm going to turn the scale to 80 so that it is much smaller. And then I want to keep the detail at 15 so it's very detailed, and I do just want to add a little bit more roughness, so let's turn the roughness to a 0.58. Now this texture is being distorted a lot, and I don't want it to be quite that distorted. So what I'm going to do is press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for the mix node. Let's drop the mix up here, and I want to click on the float and change it to color instead. I want to bring this back and bring the noise texture back so I have a bit more space, and I want to put this mix in between both of the noise textures. So we can use this mix to mix two colors together, and so I want to bring the noise texture down, and I want to put the noise texture color into value B, but then I want to take the original mapping, which isn't distorted at all, and I want to put that into color A. So now we're mixing between the distorted noise and the mapping, which is not distorted. And so now we can drag the factor, and if we turn the factor to 0, the noise is not being distorted at all, but then as we turn it up, it's going to use more and more of color B, which is the distorted noise texture. Now you can see when I drag this around, it's kind of moving the texture around. So let's click on the mix here, and I can change the type to linear light. This way, if I drag it around, it's still going to distort the noise texture, but it won't move it around quite as much. Now I want it to be only distorted by a very small amount. So I'm going to turn the factor to a 0.07. So now we have this really cool texture here where there's some noisy areas which are kind of darker, and then there's some other noisy areas which are quite lighter. I'm going to drag this noise texture up here and then kind of compact these nodes by bringing them in together. Now before we create the colors for the leather, I do want to make this more contrasty because it is all pretty gray. So I'm going to press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for a color ramp, and let's put the color ramp here after the noise texture. And then I can click on these tabs and I can drag them together, and you can see as I drag them closer and closer, it's going to make it more contrasty. So I want to make the black tab kind of to about here so you can kind of see that a bit better, and then the white tab I'll bring to about there. So now we can make the colors for the leather. So I'll press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for another mix node. Let's drop this up here, and I want to use color values, so let's change the float to color instead. And then I can drop the mix here after the color ramp. Now I want to create two different colors, so we can actually put this color ramp color into the factor. And so now this is basically acting as a mask to tell it where it's going to be color A and where it's going to be color B. So we can now change the colors for A and B. So here on color A, I want to make this kind of an orangey color, but then I want to make it darker, so it's a dark saturated brown color. And then this color here, I want to make it very dark and make it brown. So it's a very, very dark brown. And if you want to use the same exact colors that I'm using, then on this mix here, you can go to color A, and here on the hex value, you can punch in a hex value of 3C1906. So it's a very dark brown. And then here on B, I just want this to be fully black, so you can drag this down to 0, or you can punch in a hex value of 6 zeros. So we can now bring the principled shader over, and let's take the mix result, and I can put that into the base color. And then I can Control Shift and select the principled shader to preview it. Now this leather is pretty shiny, and so I do want to make it a bit more rough. So what I'm going to do is take this noise texture factor, and let's put that into the roughness so that some parts are more shiny, whereas other parts are more rough. But then I want to have more control over this, so let's select this color ramp, and I can press Shift to duplicate it, and I want to drop it here after the noise texture but before the roughness. And then with this color ramp selected, I can hit the backspace, and that's going to reset the color ramp. So if I make the values lighter, that is going to make it more rough. So if I click on the black tab here, I can make this much lighter, and now you can see the leather is a bit more rough. And if you want to use the same roughness value that I'm using, then here on the color ramp on this gray color, I'm going to use a hex value of 7F, 7F, 7F. Now later on when we create the custom node group, I do want to be able to control the roughness values. So what I can do is press Shift A, and I can go here to the search, and I can search for the hue saturation value, and I want to put this after the color ramp before the roughness. We now have this value here, and this value is going to make the texture lighter or darker, and so this will change the roughness of the material. So we can use that value later in the custom node group. So this is starting to look like leather, but it doesn't have any bump on the surface. So I'm now going to create a leather texture that we can put into the normal to give it some bump. So I'll press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I can search for the Voronoi texture. Let's drop the Voronoi down here underneath this noise, and then I can Control Shift and select it to preview it. So we can turn the scale way up, and then we can put that into the normal to give a nice little texture of leather. So I'm going to turn the Voronoi scale to 1000 so that it is very small. Now if I zoom in really close, you can see the dots are pretty smooth and they aren't very rough or bumpy. So what I'm going to do is select this linear light right here, this mix, and I'm going to press Control Shift D. So Control Shift D is going to duplicate the node, but it'll keep the wires plugged up. And so it's the same setup as this noise texture and the mapping, and that's being mixed together here into the linear light. And so we can now take this mix here, the linear light, and we can put the result into the vector, the Voronoi. And so it's going to do the same thing with this noise texture. It's going to distort the placement of the Voronoi, so now you can see those dots are very noisy. Now I want to make it very subtle because I basically want some dots, but I want the dots to just have a tiny bit of noise around them. So I'm going to turn this factor to a 0.004, just a 0.004, and now you can clearly see that there's still dots there, but they are kind of noisy. So I can now take the Voronoi texture distance and let's put that into the normal of the principled shader. And then I can Control Shift and select the principled shader to preview it. Now we need to convert this black and white data into normal data that the shader can use. So I'll press Shift A and let's go to the search, and I can search for the bump node, and let's put the bump node here after the Voronoi before the normal. And then we actually want to take the Voronoi distance and we want to put that into the height value of the bump. And now you can see it's converting it to normal data. And then I want the little dots to be popping out instead of going back in. So let's hit the invert button, and now they look like they're popping out. Now this bump map is way too strong, so I want to turn the strength down to make it less strong, and I'm going to use a strength value of 0.17. So now we have a nice little texture over the leather. Now I also want to add a little bit of noise all over the entire material. So let's take this bump, and I can press Shift D to duplicate it, and I can drop it down here. And then I want to turn off the invert because I don't want to use the invert on this one. So let's take the normal, and I can put that into the normal of the bump, and this way we can mix two bump maps together. So we now have this height value that we can add data into. So let's take the noise texture factor, and I'm going to put that into the height of this bump here. But I do want it to be pretty subtle, so I'm going to turn the strength value to a 0.13. But now there's just a little bit of noise all over the entire material. And then I also want to add one more layer of bump, but this last layer of bump is just going to be these darker areas. So if I Control Shift and select the noise texture, we're going to use use this and we're going to make it more contrasty and then put it into the bump. So I'm going to just box select some of these nodes here and I'm going to drag them over just so I have a little bit more space. So I can now click on this bump node and I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate it. Let's put it here and the normal can go into the normal. Now we're going to plug up the same texture, so the noise texture factor is going to go into the height value of this last bump. And then let's Control Shift and select this bump to preview it. So right now there's noise all over the place, but I want to make it more contrasty so you can only see the noise on those darker areas. So I can just select any of the color ramps and I can press Shift D to duplicate it, and let's drop it here between the noise texture and the third bump. So just drop it right there. And then just select this color ramp and you can hit the backspace to reset it. So we can now click on this white tab and we can drag it over, and that's going to make it more contrasty. If I Control Shift and select the color ramp, you can see what it's doing. So it's making things more and more white. So now there's just a little bit of gray areas here and there. So let's Control Shift and select the bump node, and I can actually turn the bump strength up so you can see it stronger. So now if I drag this white tab, you can see there's only going to be noise in some places here and there. And right here on this bump strength, I want to turn this to a 0.25. I think that is a pretty good strength, not too strong. And I'm going to drag this white tab right about here, about in the center, and that is looking pretty good. So now there's some areas where there's more bump. So I can Control Shift and select the final material. So now let's join this together into a custom node group. So I can click and drag to box select all the nodes except the material output. And then I can press Control G. Control G will join it together into a node group, and you can press the tab key with the node group selected to go in and out of the node group. So let's drag the node group over here and I can make it a bit bigger. And then right here on the material name, I want to click on this and press Control C to copy the name. Let's click here and press Control V to paste the name. So now it is called dark leather. And then if I tab to go into the node group, I can press the N key. That'll open up the side panel here, and we have the inputs and the outputs. And here on the BSDF, I want to click on this, and I'm going to rename it to shader because I like that a bit better. So now it's called shader. So back into the node group, we can go over here to the group input, and we can add all the custom values that we want to control. So let's bring this down here, and I first want to put the scale into the group input because this mapping is plugged up to all the textures, and so the scale is going to change the size of the entire material. So let's put the scale into the group input, and then if I click here on the inputs, I want to make this one single value. I don't want it to be 3 values, I just want it to be 1. So here on the scale, I can click on the type here, and I want to change it to float instead, so it is just one single value. And then here on the default value, I want to turn this to 1, and then right here on the minimum value, I want to turn this to 0, and that way it can't be scaled in the negative values, it can only be scaled up. And then if I go outside of the node group, I need to turn the scale back to 1 so that we can actually see the texture. So let's go back into the node group. Now I also want to be able to control just the scale of the noise and just the scale of the leather texture. So here on this noise texture, we have this scale value. So we can take the scale, we can put that into the extra socket, and then we can click on this to rename it. And I'm going to rename it to noise scale. And also right here on the minimum value, I'm just going to turn this to 0 so that we can't scale it down into negative values. And then I want to also be able to control the leather scale. And so this Vorno texture here, this is controlling the scale of that detailed leather texture. So let's take the scale and put that in here, and then if I double click on this to rename it, I'm going to rename it to leather scale. Now if we go outside of the node group, this leather scale is very big, it's at 1000, so we have to drag it around quite a lot to see it taking effect. So I'm going to go back into the node group and I'm going to make this value more sensitive. So I'll press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for the math node, and let's put the math node here between the leather scale and the Voronoi. And I want to put this leather scale into the bottom socket of the math node. And then because I want to make it more sensitive, we want to multiply the number values. So here on the add, let's change this to multiply. Then here on this value, I can turn this up, and I'm going to turn it up to like 20. So now the leather texture is way too big. So if I hit the tab key to go out of the node group, here, this leather scale, I just want to turn it down to like 35. And now if I zoom in there, you can see it again. So that is a better size. But now if I drag this around, because we multiplied the values, it's going to be much more sensitive. Now if I go back into the node group here on the leather scale, I want the default to be 35 because I like that size. And then also here on the minimum value, I'll just turn this to 0. So now we can add the different custom colors. So I'm going to click on this group input, and let's press Shift D to duplicate it, and I can drag it over here. And let's put it here above this color ramp. So then we can put color A right in here, and then also we can take color B and put that into the extra socket. And then we can rename these. So I'm just going to rename them color 1 and color 2. So now if I go outside of the node group, we have the different colors. textures. Now I also want to be able to control some of the settings of the textures. So let's click on one of the group inputs. I can press Shift D to duplicate it, and let's drop it here above the mapping. So I want to be able to control the detail of the textures. So right here on this first noise texture, we have this roughness value here, and I can turn this up and down to change the look of the leather. So let's take this roughness from this noise texture, put it in here, and then I want to rename this, and I'm going to rename this to Leather Detail 1. Now right here on this other noise texture, we also have this detail value, and I can drag this up and down, and that's going to change how the leather looks. And I like being able to control that value as well. So let's take the detail, put that in there, and then I can rename this to Leather Detail 2. So let's click on this group input here. I'll press Shift D to duplicate it. Let's drag it down here, and then this hue saturation value is going into the roughness, and the value is going to make it lighter or darker, which will make it more rough or more shiny. So let's put the value into the extra socket here, and then I can rename this to roughness here on the side panel. And then I want to add the 3 layers of bump. So this first one here is going to make the leather look a bit more damaged or less damaged. So let's take the strength, and I can put that here into the extra socket, and then I can click on this to rename it, and I'm going to rename this one to damage bump strength. Now this second one here, this is just some overall noise. So let's put the strength into the extra socket, and then I can rename this to noise bump strength. And then this last one here is controlling the leather texture. So let's put the strength here into the extra socket, and I can rename this to leather bump strength. So now that we're finished, to make the node setup look a bit nicer, I can click on the group inputs, and I can press Control H. So Control H is going to collapse the nodes. So Control H, drag that down, Control H, and then this one here, Control H. And so this way it's only going to show the inputs that are plugged into it. So I can tab to go out of the node group, and here is the dark leather material. So we have the overall scale to change the entire size of the material, then we just have the noise scale, and then we also just have the leather scale. Then we have the 2 different colors, so we have color 1 and color 2. And then we also have these different detail levels, so leather detail 1, and then also leather detail 2, and this is going to change how the leather looks. Then we also have the roughness, and then finally we have 3 layers of bump, so we can change the damage bump strength, we can also change the noise bump strength, and we can also change the leather bump strength. And that is it, so that is the dark leather material. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and thank you for watching. And if you'd like to help support this channel and purchase these materials, you can purchase them on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page with the links in the description. And if you'd like to purchase all of my procedural materials, then definitely check out my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack. And my Ultimate Procedural Material Pack has all of my procedural materials pre-set up in Blender's asset browser with custom thumbnails, sorted catalogs, and customizable node groups. And you can also check out my procedural material packs if you'd like to purchase packs of 10 materials. And if you'd like to learn how to create any of my materials, you can also check out my procedural material tutorial playlist here on YouTube. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you for watching.